So clearly I can just end the video here. We've established that Joyce is a superior writer. We've established that Virginia Woolf does not know how to represent the human consciousness. I made a video on To The Lighthouse just to bash Virginia Woolf because I hate her writing that much. I'm kidding, of course. But this raises a legitimate question, which is, what are Joyce and Woolf doing differently? Joyce is presenting Molly's unfiltered thoughts. So what exactly is Woolf doing? To figure that out, let's go back to the idea of the blurring of the boundary between the narrator and the character. So we've established that in the Mrs. Ramsay passage, the third-person omniscient narrator is focalizing on Mrs. Ramsay, which means diving into her head, using its omniscience to report her thoughts. And that when that happens, you get a blurring of the lines between the narrator and Mrs. Ramsay. For example, in the free indirect speech portions. That could be remedied tomorrow. If it were fine, they should go for a picnic. Everything seemed possible. Everything seemed right. You can imagine the third-person narrator jumping into Mrs. Ramsay's mind and speaking as her, speaking the thoughts that she's thinking. And then at other points, the narrator jumps into her head, but doesn't speak as her. It speaks for her. It reports what she's thinking and doing. Just now, but this cannot last, she thought, dissociating herself from the moment while they were all talking about boots. So let's think of what exactly the narrator is accomplishing here. The narrator is jumping into her mind, looking at her thoughts, sifting through the thoughts, rearranging them, editing them, pruning them, and then presenting them to us. Some of the thoughts the narrator seems to report verbatim, like, that could be remedied tomorrow. But maybe it isn't verbatim. It seems like it's a thought directly from her head. It seems unfiltered, but it is grammatically correct. Maybe she thought in a slightly different way. Maybe her precise thoughts were, tomorrow could fix. And then the narrator looked at her thoughts and then rearranged them into a slightly more appealing form. Similarly, the narrator could have looked through her thoughts and then taken out the part where Mr. Ramsay's talking really loudly about boots right next to her. He's really into boots. He's really excited about this new pair of boots he bought. And Mrs. Ramsay's off thinking her deep thoughts, but for a split second, she's distracted and then like a giant pair of boots pops into her mind. And the narrator looks at that and is like, you know, I don't think that needs to be there, and then cuts it out. So really, I want to think about the Woolf passage not as an instance of direct, unfiltered access into Mrs. Ramsay's thoughts, but as a collaboration between Mrs. Ramsay and the narrator, where the narrator looks into her mind and then curates the material and then sorts and then throws out the parts that it thinks aren't relevant, and then takes this nice package and presents it to the reader. And note that it thinks is important here, because the narrator is thinking. The narrator has a will, the narrator has an agenda. The narrator wants us to know about this insight that Mrs. Ramsay had about the nature of human existence. So it takes the raw material of her thoughts and then molds them into the finished product of a beautiful metaphor, and then shows that metaphor to the reader. Now we've looked at the form of Joyce's writing and the form of Woolf's writing, how they convey their content, how Joyce portrays Molly's mind, how Woolf portrays Mrs. Ramsay's. But now let's ask why. Why does Joyce do it in his way? Why does Woolf do it in hers? What's more effective about Joyce's way and what's more effective about Woolf's way? Now there's an easy answer that we've already arrived at. Joyce shows us the unfiltered thoughts of a character. Woolf takes those unfiltered thoughts, filters them, and then shows us the result. And then going back to the issue of verisimilitude, we can say, hey, Joyce is very, very similar. He's presenting raw, unfiltered thoughts. Woolf is less so. She simplifies those thoughts and makes them more comprehensible, more elegant, and just nicer to read. But I'm going to argue that this is a radically oversimplified explanation. And to argue that, I'm going to start off with a very non-scientific look at how the mind works. If you accept that Joyce's portrayal of the mind is the most accurate you can get, the most pure way of presenting what's going on in your mind, showing you an unfiltered, complete look into what's happening in the human consciousness, I'm going to argue you're wrong, and here's why. Joyce focuses solely on the verbal aspects of our minds. He might be directly reporting the verbal thoughts that are inside our head, but he can't describe the vast array of non-verbal thoughts, non-verbal emotions, non-verbal feelings in our minds without filtering in some sense. After all, he's a novelist. He works with words, and our minds aren't just about words. To convey everything about our minds, he would have to translate these inarticulable feelings, emotions, thoughts into words. And that's filtering them. I'm going to argue that in the Molly passage, instead of taking the non-verbal parts of Molly's mind, translating those into words, and then showing those words to the reader, Joyce just dispenses with that entirely, presents only the parts of her mind that he can present unfiltered. He's absolutely committed to verisimilitude, but in committing, he leaves out a great portion of what's happening. And this is not meant to criticize him for doing so. It's very clearly deliberate and enhances the meaning of the passage. Let's have an example of what exactly Joyce is doing. I'm going to make up my own example to simplify things. Let's say I'm a literary character. Let's try to get into my mind. Suppose I'm walking through a meadow and I see a cow. Now I'm going to tell you part of my backstory, which is that when I was a child, I was chased through a field by a stampeding herd of cows, and that I am horribly traumatized from that experience, and just seeing a cow makes me seize up terrified, makes me flash back to that childhood memory. Let's think about how Joyce would write this scene if you were writing in the same way that he wrote the Molly scene. You might think that he would write it like this. Beautiful day, birds singing, flowers blooming, cow, that time in my childhood, stampeding cows, trauma, flashback. But I actually don't think he would do it like that. I think he would do it something like, beautiful day, birds singing, flowers blooming, ah! Because if I were that literary character and I saw a stampeding cow, and I were reminded of that trauma, I would not verbalize my flashback. I maybe verbalize a scream, both externally and internally, and that flashback is something that can't be articulated directly with words. For example, the sight of the cow stampeding towards me, the smell of the cow, is the feeling of the sun on my skin, the dry taste of my mouth, even the moos of the cows. You might say, hey, we can articulate the moos verbally, but you actually can't. You can approximate the moos verbally. Moo. But you can't get them exactly down. You can't convey the intonation. You can't convey the volume. You can't convey the gradations in the sound. And aside from the moos, there's the sound of the hooves, which you can't directly represent. You have to use automatopoeia, which is an approximation. Then there's things like music, which you just can't put in words. Since these things aren't directly articulable through words, and assuming that Joyce is committed to presenting exclusively a direct line into the human mind, a direct, unfiltered line, he has to omit all the non-verbal aspects of the human consciousness. But that's a deliberate omission. The form in which he presents Molly's thoughts is clearly considered, is clearly purposeful. So what does it accomplish? I'm going to argue that in addition to presenting the pure, unfiltered essence of verbal thought, he's also attempting to emphasize the gap that's present because he's only willing to present direct verbal thoughts. So by depriving us of access to Molly's memory and her built-in associations and her impressions and the entire nonverbal side of the mind, Joyce actually shows us how our verbal thought patterns are dependent on the nonverbal thought patterns, how they interact and mesh together to form the whole of our consciousness, and how when you remove the nonverbal side, even if you're presenting the verbal side non-filtered, there will be dependencies that are missing. There will be references to nonverbal portions of Molly's memory that are cut off. So going back to my own cow example, the scream, ah, is cut off from the memory of the stampeding herd. You can see that this scream, when it's not tied to the non-verbal portion of the character's memory, doesn't quite make sense. And when Joyce does it, it's intentional, because he wants to show how these dependencies work. He gives us a lot of insight into the way minds work with his unfiltered representation of Molly's verbal thoughts. But he also gives us a lot of insight into her mind by excluding part of her thoughts, the non-verbal patterns in her mind. So now let's take a look at what Woolf would do, how she would represent this theme, if she were to rewrite the scene in the style of the Mrs. Ramsay dinner scene. It would probably go something like, Andrew walked through the field. Beautiful day. Birds singing. Flowers blooming. He saw a cow and was suddenly plunged into a flashback from his youth, etc., etc., etc. Here we have the narrator filtering the character's lived experience. There was some free and direct speech with beautiful day, birds singing, flowers blooming. Maybe that was directly plucked from the character's consciousness, or maybe it was slightly edited. But the part about the flashback, about the character's traumatic experience being chased by a herd of stampeding cows as a child, is nonverbal, and it's been filtered by the narrator into text. There's no way to directly convey this experience, the experience of being thrust back into a memory, into a flashback, and there's no way to convey the sensory input of this flashback. The sounds, the tastes, the sights, the feelings, the smells. There's no way to convey these things directly through text. They have to be translated. And by filtering these nonverbal patterns in the consciousness, Woolf in some way provides a fuller and more verisimilar portrait of what's going on in the character's mind. She might not have the pure verisimilitude of unfiltered verbal thoughts, but she does incorporate an aspect of consciousness that Joyce excludes. We can take a look at the Woolf passage again and see how her filtering of the nonverbal aspects of experience works. This is from the end of the passage. There's a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights. In the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby. So we've already established that it would be completely unreasonable for Mrs. Ramsay to come up with this beautifully constructed, masterfully written metaphor for the human experience as she's sitting at the dining table. Honestly, unless in that moment, the muses looked down from the heavens and decided to endow her with the ability to perfectly encapsulate her lived experience at that point in time through an elegant, timeless metaphor. There's absolutely no way she came up with that on the spot. But if we look at it considering that we know there's a narrator filtering and editing and rearranging all the things that she's thinking, whether they're verbal or nonverbal, then we can get a better understanding of what's happening. What's happening is the narrator is presenting an approximation, a translation. We could call it a metaphor for what's going on in Mrs. Ramsay's head. We've established that Mrs. Ramsay isn't thinking in only words. There's a non-verbal component to her thoughts that's just as vital as the verbal component. Maybe Mrs. Ramsay's verbal thought patterns do include the word eternity, but maybe at the same time she's grasping onto this non-verbal idea. Maybe there's a formless, wordless concept in her head, this concept of forever, that the narrator can't directly communicate to the reader. So maybe since there's no way to directly articulate what Mrs. Ramsay is feeling, the narrator takes the raw stuff of Mrs. Ramsay's mind and crafts it into a metaphor, into an approximation, into a translation of Mrs. Ramsay's eternity. And that's my analysis of Woolf. So to conclude, I'll just summarize the main points of this video. We're interested in how Joyce and Woolf respectively employ stream of consciousness in these selected passages. In particular, we're interested in how the form and the content of their writing intertwine, how the form serves as the vehicle for the content. To this end, I argue that Joyce commits himself to faithfully reproducing Molly's unfiltered thoughts in his passage, which both precisely conveys the only precisely conveyable part of the mind and underscores the conspicuous absence of Molly's untranslatable nonverbal consciousness. On the other hand, Woolf curates and molds both the verbal and the nonverbal aspects of Mrs. Ramsay's consciousness, filtering and translating and crafting the raw material of her mind in an attempt to distill the inarticulable, impressionistic essence of her emotion and thought and lived experience into verbal form. So in their respective ways, Joyce and Woolf both guide us to a better understanding of that which we can never understand, the mind of another person. Thanks and bye.